Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Annabella and I'm originally from Santa Monica in California, where I was raised by a single mother in a very mediocre, rather shabby apartment block, where my mother fought tooth and nail to keep a roof over our heads. Life was exceedingly tough, and my mother worked as a waitress at a local restaurant in the evenings in order to raise enough money to provide for our every need. Growing up, my mother had a very tumultuous, turbulent childhood herself, as both her parents were alcoholics, who literally decided to hand her over to social services for adoption when she was about only 8 years old. Her parents soon realized that their daughter would have a better life if she was raised by two parents who could give her the lifestyle and attention that they believed she deserved. My mother remembers drifting from one foster home to another and being exposed to a series of so much abuse, many of it sexual by nature. It would seem that the very people entrusted to be the guardians of her care had all but taken advantage of her vulnerability and youthful naivety and exploited it with their insidious evil agendas. There were times when my mother was placed in the care of more congenial people, but sometimes the discrimination and favouritism between her and the original siblings was so blatantly obvious that she began to feel like she never ever belonged and was uncherished in every way. She was often aware that the only reason that she was being taken care of was more for monetary gain rather than for care or love. One day I remember my mother telling me that if anything was to ever happen to her, that I must promise her that under no circumstances should the authorities ever find me. I don't want you to end up in the claws of the ineffectual foster system, she would tell me. Although there are good people out there, sadly the system doesn't shelter, fortify or protect you from the very individuals that may foster you for more nefarious, iniquitous motives. I don't want you to end up emotionally damaged or traumatized, my mother would say. So if something happens to me, I want you to look for a lady called Rosa Wintergreen, who was a girl I was fostered with many long years ago. Growing up as kids, we swore we would be there for each other through thick and thin and through hell and high water. I do not know where she is, but I know she went to live in Kentucky and is happily married now. But I lost touch with her and have no idea what her married name actually is. But if something happens to me, I want you to find her because she will definitely take care of you, and that's a promise. I remember looking at my mother and reassuring her that nothing was ever going to happen to her and not to worry, but my mother laughed and took me into her arms and said, "I love you more than anything in the world. That's why I want to protect you from the villainous predators out there, because believe me, they're depraved, odious sharks among the dolphins. And some of those sharks are disguised as dolphins, as a cunning, deceptive tactic to lure you into their trap. And I want to protect you from that." One day my mother came down with a very bad bout of flu, and she was unable to work for a week or so. And so I was nursing her better with chicken broth and all kinds of cough medicines. My mother told me that she was actually getting better, but the next day when I came into her bedroom with a glass of orange juice and some sliced buttered toast, I immediately sensed something was very wrong. My mother was lying back on her bed, looking like a white pasty mannequin, only her mouth was wide open, and her eyes looked like they were vacant and empty, lifeless like glass marbles. "Mum," I said, tapping her on the shoulders, but she didn't respond to my touch. I started to shake my mother violently as hard as I could, but she lay limp and lifeless in my arms, and was as cold as ice to the touch. "Mum," I said, shaking her again, only to get the same reaction. Suddenly the grim revelation that my mother was dead hit me like a ton of bricks. I felt as if all the blood had been drained from my body, and I remember I felt completely empty and devoid of any emotion. It was like a sense of hopeless despair engulfed my entire being like a ravaging disease, robbing me of the ability to feel anything at all. It was just too terrible for words. For a moment I stood there like a frozen statue, staring at my mother's corpse in total and utter disbelief. I felt certain that I was engaged in a terrifying nightmare from which I would ultimately wake up. I do remember rubbing my eyes incredibly hard just to make sure that I wasn't dreaming, but the reality became blindingly clear, like a spotlight being thrust into your face. My mother was indeed dead, and I started to shake and convulse like someone having a seizure. I remember it was like the floodgates opened and the rain pelted down my face in heavy, thunderous showers. I began to sob and sob and sob until I could literally cry no more, because I was like a dry vessel. I held my mother's corpse in my arms for many long hours, telling her how much I loved her and what she meant to me. And then I surrendered to the excruciating emotional exhaustion of this horrifying event and fell into a deep sleep, clutching her dead body very tightly. I remember waking up 24 hours later with the sun streaming through the room and a warm, cheerful radiance lit up the whole area. It looked like a blissfully beautiful day, but it was anything but. I was amazed to see that there were blowflies buzzing around my mother's body and already feasting on her eyes. It was so awful to see her like this, and I knew her body was decomposing very quickly. I stayed in the apartment for a couple of days until I could bear it no longer, as my mother's body began to bloat and take on a sweet, sickly odour, and was pungent and vile in its smell that made me feel so hideously sick. Let's just say when you have smelt a dead body, you never ever forget that smell. It stays with you like a recorded memory that you can just never shift. I knew I needed to get out of the apartment because there was no money to pay for the rent, and my mother's body needed to be moved before the apartment block stunk to high heaven. I said my final goodbyes to my mother. I knew that I would have to call the authorities later, but not while I was in the apartment, because I would be immediately whisked into foster care, and that could never happen. I had one mission now, and that was to find Rosa Wintergreen in Kentucky. I gathered a few belongings together in a backpack, which included a flashlight, some clothes, and a sleeping bag, along with about $20, and that was all that I had in the world. I was well and truly homeless, and because I was so emotionally distraught, I didn't really care about anything anymore, which I believed helped me to cope and subsequently adapt to the shock of ultimately being homeless. Many people have asked me since the ordeal, what was the first day being homeless like? I have one answer alone, and that was that I was emotionally too numb to even remember. Once I'd left my home, I informed the authorities anonymously about my mother's deceased body, and left them to deal with her remains. I knew that I would never be able to attend her burial, because that would expose me to social services, and that just couldn't happen. Fast forward several days, and I'd literally been sleeping rough on Venice Beach. I was amazed to discover how many perfectly decent human beings like myself were so down on their luck and had subsequently been made homeless. It seemed so dreadfully unfair. One man had once been a millionaire, and through a series of fortuitous random events that he could never have predicted, had subsequently ended up losing absolutely everything. At one time he had owned 2 homes and a boat, and literally lost it all. So it can happen to pretty much anyone. At only 14 years of age, some of the older homeless people kept a close watch over me, and I was warned to sleep over my shoes because they would be stolen from me when I slept. How crazy is that? Some of the homeless people had been in and out of shelters and low-income housing for years on end, invariably always ended up back on the streets. And there were those that were literally homeless because they wanted to spend every last penny on drugs, such as meth and heroin, without forking out any rent, while others chose to indulge in drugs to help them overcome the stress of actually being homeless. Their attitude was if they were down on their luck anyway, they might as well be as high as a kite. Some believed the meth helped them to keep awake at night so that they could guard all their stuff from potential thieves who might steal things while they were fast asleep. Then there were people that were clearly mentally disturbed, suffering from mental disorders, and they were the scariest people of all, because they could be sweet one moment and volatile, aggressive and explosive the next, and sometimes even dangerous. I also met youngsters like myself who'd run away from foster homes with stories that sounded remarkably like my mother's harrowing account. I knew then that I would rather be homeless than exposed to the potential abuse of a foster home. Not that all foster homes are like that, of course. I was warned by a very kindly man to sleep at close proximity to him during the night so he could keep an eye on me, because women had been exposed to very serious dangers sleeping homeless, from being beaten up and sexually assaulted. I began to realise how hugely challenging it was to be homeless and how vulnerable I actually was. During the day I developed a fabulous technique in hiding all my belongings away, as I didn't want to carry out anything around with me during the day, like those homeless people do with their shopping trolleys. Those ones are very sad indeed. I was to discover a dark blanket in a dumpster dive with some of the homeless people, and believe me, dumpster diving is the most disgusting, revolting thing to have to do. But believe me, people do throw out some really good stuff, even new things, which is incredible, but you usually find that at the bottom of the dumpster, and all the horrible stuff you have to get through first before you finally get to the good things. It's always the way. Isn't that uncanny? I would cover up my worldly possessions with this brown blanket and leave them up in the branches of a tree, and it was almost impossible to see that it was even there, because the brown of the blanket perfectly camouflaged all my possessions, which meant I was free to do as I pleased without being lumbered with my stuff during the day. There were homeless people that did have full-time jobs, but they still could not afford a roof over their heads, which for me was insane to see. How crazy is that? I could not bear the idea of begging, because that is the most degrading thing to do, and so I took the initiative of walking around residential areas, knocking on doors, asking people if they needed a dog walker or someone to wash their cars, and the people did not realise I was homeless, so many agreed to give me a few odd jobs, which I was very grateful for. I'm afraid that people do often look on the homeless like a lower form of pond life that you want to avoid at all costs, because you just might catch the debilitating disease from them. I think they thought I was a 14-year-old kid looking to make some extra pocket money, but I never ever gave them the impression of being homeless, which you definitely don't want to do. I began to raise enough money to pay for a trip to Kentucky, because my hope lay in ultimately finding Rosa Wintergreen. Many of my homeless friends warned me not to get my hopes up at all, because they felt that it would end up all blowing in my face. The one thing I noticed about my homeless friends is that they were so intent on just surviving one day to the next that many of them had no focus whatsoever on the future, and that horrified me. You could ask them about their long-term intentions, and they really did not know. They seemed so reluctant to visualize a brighter future for themselves, which was awfully sad. One girl told me that she would never ever dare to look in the windows at Bloomingdale's because she knew she would never be able to afford to buy any of those nice things, which would cause her to feel very depressed and downcast. I remember thinking that her gloomy outlook on life was ultimately sealing her fate, because she refused to entertain any possible hope that tomorrow might possibly be a brighter day. It was so ingrained in her psyche that things would never ever change for her, and invariably they didn't. I, on the other hand, would go to Bloomingdale's and decide exactly what accessories I would have in my bedroom when I finally had that home of my own. I visualized it so intently in my head and could see myself moving in with Rosa and her family, and I knew it would happen because I could see it so clearly that it was that tangible and that real for me. The only problem is that it had not manifested yet in my reality, but I knew that I would be soon grabbing it with both of my hands. My homeless friends just could not understand why I was so positive and upbeat about what they considered was a very bleak future for me. I would be told things like, "Don't get your hopes up. You're going to be so disappointed. It's never going to work out for you. You're never going to make any money." And I was ambushed and assaulted with all these negative words and thoughts, but I refused to believe and engage in any of them, because life without hope is a life that is defeated. Fast forward a month or so, and I had left Venice Beach, and I was now in Kentucky. I was making tracks to an abandoned home that I'd heard about surreptitiously on a bus ride, and it seemed like the perfect spot for me to make a temporary base while I conducted my search for Rosa Greenwood, that I was beginning to realise was looking like a needle in a haystack. When I did find the location of this abandoned home, I was almost reluctant to enter the area, as the derelict white house that was built on an elevated wooded clearing was so overgrown with long, vigorous seeded grass that was thick and dense. Everything was so jungly, and there were creepers climbing all over the house very untidily. My first impression of this ramshackled place was it really had a sinister ambience, almost like the ruinous, run-down abode was literally staring at you with hauntingly sinister eyes. There is something about a large, dilapidated, empty home that leaves you feeling that something is distinctly off. I do remember thinking that the house had been a quality building at some stage, that had been built with bricks and mortar and very solid foundations, and in its time it was an imposing, respectable building, but certainly not any more. I was reluctant to enter the building that was so dark and sinister even during the day, but you know what, I just didn't care, because I needed a firm base for myself, and although the house that was less than agreeable, it would just have to do. I entered the house, and as I went through the passageway into the kitchen living area, it was so much lighter, and I noticed the floors were covered in candle wax, matches and drug paraphernalia, so clearly some homeless people had been using this place as a base at some time. But they clearly had moved on and not laid down any permanent roots. I did my best to clean up the mess, but removing candle wax is not an easy job, especially off carpets, by any manner of means. This house was scantily furnished, with a large chair here and there, but it looked like someone had ransacked the whole place and all the furnishings had been removed. I spent the next few days going to supermarkets all over Kentucky and asking people if they knew any Rosas in the area, or someone with the name Rosa Wintergreen, but no one had ever heard of her, and all the Rosas they knew about had never been to foster homes before. I was beginning to feel exhausted from my search. Naturally, I had tried to access records in the area, but once again there was no one called Rosa Wintergreen that seemed to be living in Kentucky. I knew she was obviously using her married name, but I was running out of money now, and so once again I resorted to finding odd jobs to do around the area, and believe it or not, it wasn't easy. I did manage to find a job handing out flyers, and I thought this would be a good opportunity to ask people in the area if they knew of Rosa Wintergreen, but once again I drew the short straw. No one had ever heard of her. One night when I was retiring into my sleeping bag on the floor in the living area of the abandoned house, I heard the sound of someone moving around the premises, which really scared me half to death, because I realised suddenly that I was definitely not alone. All kinds of alarming thoughts entered my head. Had someone discovered that I was squatting out here on the premises? I had made my presence very discreet and covered my tracks very well, I thought. I'd be surprised if anyone had observed or seen me, but maybe I was wrong. Armed with my flashlight that I always kept very well supplied with batteries, I crept out of the house and crawled behind a tree that was surrounded by a dense thicket, so hiding for me was very easy. I did feel a lot safer outside than in that dark, sinister house. I switched my light off because it was a bright night, and the white light of the full moon illuminated the whole area. It was amazing how terribly menacing, foreboding and sinister this dingy house looked in the darkness of this night. It really looked like the film set for America's Most Haunted Buildings, or for the screening of some ghastly horror where the teenagers run for their lives from a demented, deranged killer carrying a machete in his hands. It had that kind of creepy ambience about it, if you know what I mean. I suddenly held my breath for a long moment, because I heard it again. Footsteps were walking past me, but these feet, although clearly bipedal, were very thunderous in their sound, much like the feeling of a very weighty animal walking past you, like an elephant trapeding around in the brush. I peered wearily through the undergrowth to see this enormous creature standing yards away from me. And when I say yards, I mean yards. I could almost have reached out to touch him, because that is how close he was to me. The only way I can describe him to you is he looked like a human blown up to a 10-foot-tall, 1,000-pound giant, with very obvious ape-like influences. This critter was covered in loose, shaggy, matted hair that smelt really yucky. The only way that I can describe that smell to you is it smelt like rotting garbage and meat that's on the turn. Even though it was light, I only really got to see how colossal and monstrously big this hairy creature was, but I also could see the conical head, the massive shoulders, and the overlong arms and human-like hands and feet. Those were very clear. I also could detect its red eye shine. I've never been so terrified in all my life. It was the scariest moment that I've ever endured, because I could sense I was in very serious mortal danger, and I was close to staring death in the face. I was so sure the creature could hear me. Why was he standing so close to me? Did he know where I was hiding? Would he suddenly pounce on me? I tried not to make any sound, and the tension in my body was so tight that I could literally feel my whole body cramping up. But I knew I could not move a muscle, and it was killing me. I had to keep very quiet and stay very, very still. The creature appeared to be examining something very intently in his very thick fingers and rolling it around curiously in his hands. I realised with utter horror that it was my makeup mirror that had slipped out of my bag earlier in the day and dropped somewhere in the undergrowth, while this creature had somehow recovered it. The critter appeared to be examining it extremely closely, as if he was trying to figure out what on earth it actually was. He was wearing a very muddled, confused expression on his face that I could detect even in the night. Suddenly he caught a glimpse of his own reflection in the mirror and was so shocked he almost dropped the mirror because he got such a fright, because he could see his face reflected back at him, but I don't think he realised it actually was him. For a moment he looked around him as if he was half expecting to see the creature that he had detected in the mirror standing near him. Once again he looked in the mirror and suddenly realised he was looking at himself, and clearly he didn't like what he was seeing, because he threw the mirror across the grass and let out a very irritated grunt, as if to say, "Well, that was a waste of time, and what a useless object that is." I can say for sure that vanity was not one of his strong points. Suddenly I could see 2 pairs of red eye shine at about 8 feet off the ground, looking towards the giant creature, and I realised with horror that there must be others just like him around. This revelation caused me to virtually freak, but I tried to compose myself because I didn't want to draw attention to myself. But I want to tell you this, I was living on borrowed time, I felt sure of that. However, to my relief, they appeared to be chattering to him in a strange monkey language, and then I saw him walking towards the other critters, and then they suddenly bolted off into the dark night, sounding like a herd of elephants as they thundered away. I can honestly say to you that I was overwhelmed with huge relief. As I got up, I staggered to my feet, and my body was so cramped over that it took a while to get my circulation back. I remember wondering if this creature could be the reason that the previous squatters and even owner vacated the property. I could never be sure, but one thing I was certain of was that I was never going to stay here, not for a single other night, because this creature terrified the living daylights out of me. For a long time I would wonder what the heck I saw that night. The very next day I was walking past an enchanting-looking farmhouse in the area, going to the bus stop with my backpack on my back, when I found myself talking to a kindly woman who was feeding her chickens in the backyard. She ran over to where I was and inquired after me. She was very friendly and looked at my backpack curiously. "Where are you going?" she asked me. "Oh, to the bus stop," I said. "Do you mind me asking why a young girl like you is out here on her own? Are you running away from home?" she inquired. "I don't have a home," I said, tears welling up in my eyes, and I wiped them away quickly, desperately trying to conceal them from her, but she had seen them. The woman looked at me very sympathetically. I ran away from home once when I was a little girl, and my dad was beating up my mother at the time. I do understand, you know. I've been there myself, and it's not a pretty place to be. You're not going to tell the authorities on me, are you? I asked, looking at her in absolute horror. Now, why would I do a thing like that, she asked me. Before I knew it, I was telling this delightful woman all about my life and how I was looking for Rosa Wintergreen and had had absolutely no luck in tracing her. Fast forward a few days, and I couldn't believe it. I was actually staying with this lovely, beautiful lady called Lisa, who was trying her level best to help me locate Rosa Wintergreen, but no one had ever heard of her. It was almost as if she had never actually existed. It really was a rather extraordinary mystery. Could my mother have got the name wrong? Well, it was likely, I thought. One day Lisa hit me with the most wonderful bombshell, if you can call it that. She asked me if I would consider staying with her indefinitely, and I was utterly thrilled to pieces, because I had warmed to Lisa so much, and I could envisage a life with her. So I immediately said yes. After that, I never ever looked back, because she became the most extraordinary, loving and amazing mother to me. She would describe me as the stray cat that landed on her doorstep looking for a loving home. She would say that the thing about stray cats is that they have an incredible way of getting under your skin, and sooner or later you cannot even imagine or envisage your life without them, because you love them so very much. Lisa had 2 adult sons who had subsequently left home, so she lived on her pig farm with her husband Huck, and they ended up taking care of me and adopting me as their own daughter. Lisa once told me that she'd actually prayed to God for a daughter, and so when it never transpired, she was bitterly disappointed and aggrieved. But then it seemed that God had other ideas and had answered her prayer later on in her life, which really delighted Lisa. It was not long that I was in Bloomingdale's buying all the things that I'd visualised for my bedroom with Lisa, and we ended up living a very happy idyllic life in the countryside, where I only spent 4 months of that life homeless. I was able to discover that there was actually a woman called Rosa Greenwin, not Wintergreen, and when I met her, I realised she was indeed my mother's long-lost friend, and it was emotional to meet her and share in all the memories that she had of my mother. By this time I was so happy living with Lisa and Huck, I literally could not conceive of leaving her, because we were now family. So life really does have a funny way of actually working out. It was only in later years that I discovered that the mystical creature I had encountered that night was in fact a Bigfoot. But it is a strange way that the serendipitous events that followed led me to actually meet Lisa. So perhaps the Bigfoot played a part in that. One thing I'd like to say to all your listeners is to never ever give up. Always believe and visualize what you want your future to be, because believe me, the universe, or God if you like, will bring you that outcome, but you have to believe it first. I want to say that even when the worst comes to the worst, and supposing you were to find yourself homeless, because it does happen to some people, I want to say that the human spirit is literally built to survive, and we're all incredible fighters with more inner strength than we give ourselves credit for. On the streets it was not as horrendous as one might imagine. It's not pleasant by any strength of the imagination, but it did make me realise that even if you were to hit rock bottom, that is not the most terrible place to be. And when you're at the bottom, the only way is actually up. So always think big for your life, be positive, and there are no limitations for your future or your dreams. I'm living proof that you can ultimately get what you believe, not what you deserve. So believe in your future, and you can reach for the stars. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Simon, and I grew up in Melbourne in Australia, which is Victoria's largest city during the 80s. We lived in a red brick bungalow-style home with a grey slate roof, white French windows and matching white shutters, as well as a spacious manicured backyard with a fiberglass swimming pool and a roofed entertainment area that overlooked the swimming pool. We had stunningly beautiful garden in those days with lush emerald green grass and a scattering of pretty trees. The only problem with Melbourne is that you can quite literally get 4 climates during the course of one day, so the weather can be very temperamental, and we usually get plenty of rainfall, but our climate is exceedingly hot from December to March every single year. Growing up, we lived in an up-and-coming residential area near to Port Melbourne Beach, which had a sandy shoreline and a fishing pier. As kids, we would go fishing regularly and taking our dogs for long walks along the beach, and surfing was something that we engaged in very frequently because some of the breakers were brilliant. I lived in an up-and-coming area where people had a little more money than most to splash out on extra improvements to their homes. It was not uncommon in those days to have a really grand house situated next door to a run-down old shack, which was seemingly incongruous for the area, as you can imagine. Nowadays you tend to have much more affluent areas separated from the less prosperous ones, but in the 80s it was a very different matter altogether. I grew up with my younger brother Andrew and my 2 parents, who worked as very successful dentists in Melbourne. Growing up in Melbourne in the 80s was great fun because our lifestyles were carefree, laid back and very easygoing, and in those days you never really worried about locking your front door because we lived a very alfresco lifestyle with friends popping in around regularly for chats, which is pretty normal in the Aussie lifestyle. Australians are well known for being seen with their backpacks all over the world, from the London Underground to the New York Metro, because for some reason many of us Aussies have a bee in our bonnet about travelling. Maybe on a very subconscious deep down level we feel rather cut off from the rest of the world geographically. Growing up I was no exception to this strange rule, and I literally could not wait to finish school and go travelling for a couple of years. I remember I had a huge globe in my bedroom, and my brother and I would whirl it around on our mahogany desk and decide on the places that we wanted to visit on our travels. We knew we would need to raise the money for travelling, and so we set about doing all kinds of odd jobs for people. We would mow lawns, cut people's hedges, remove weeds, clean swimming pools, wash cars, walk dogs, and even paint and repair stuff for people. I promise you my brother and I worked tirelessly to accumulate a stockpile of money for our travels, and soon we had more than enough to ensure that we could afford to travel quite extensively, and I have no words to describe to you how thrilled we were, because mildly speaking, we were absolutely elated. Our first port of call was North America, of course, and believe me, we had so many exciting adventures there, and I truly was in awe of what an awesome country America is, with a warm, friendly people, exciting cities and breathtaking landscapes. However, it was Brazil that my brother and I had an extraordinary experience that would quite literally transform our lives and would make us ask for many long years after our travels, what on earth was that? Who on earth was that? And finally, why on earth were those two together? That is indeed the most curious question I have of all, the answers of which I still don't have. My story begins when my brother and I hired a guide to take us through one of the very dense forest areas of Brazil. We would never have possessed the courage to attempt such a challenge on our own, as we were only too aware of the treacherous dangers of the forest, the wild animals, and the horrifying tales of people getting lost, never ever to be seen again. In the 80s we had heard many of those alarming tales, and in a moment of cowardice, when our senses prevailed, we almost nearly gave up on the idea completely. Our guide was barely able to speak a single word of English, so we literally communicated with a series of nods and gestures. It was clear he knew how to navigate the forest that was so densely overgrown that the guide would use his machete to clear a pathway for us. Our plan was to camp out for a couple of nights in the forest, so we were well equipped with all our camping supplies, and I remember feeling incredibly excited. The forest was like entering another world altogether, consisting of intriguing tall rosewood, mahogany, laurel and rubber trees, and some really exquisite vegetation in varying shades of greens, including some colourful flowering plants that were draped on the forest floor like collective works of exquisite art. The bird song in the forest was utterly awesome and enchanting, and I noticed some unusual colourful birds, such as parrots and macaws, that clearly had made this environment their home. I will say we did see phenomenal insect life, like colonies of ants carrying large leaves with their tiny bodies, and the hugest, most colourful caterpillars that I've ever seen, along with the weirdest bugs, the likes of such that I've never seen before. some that were so extraordinary and utterly intriguing. My brother and I walked for literally hours with this amazing guide who seemed to know the forest like the back of his hands. At one stage we were surrounded with lots of monkeys that were dancing from one tree to the next and acknowledging us very excitedly. There were lovely mothers with beautiful babies and large males. One of the male monkeys sitting on a branch snatched my brother's hat from his head and ran off with it, which was really funny. The creature was examining Simon's hat with a keen, curious interest. Suddenly the hat was snatched from him by another monkey, then another, and yet another. Before long, Simon's hat was doing its rounds in the monkey colony, and poor Simon was the only one to find the abduction of his hat far from amusing. One of the monkeys put the hat on his head, and it swamped his head completely, and I hooted with laughter because it was hilariously funny. Simon was the only one who looked incredibly glum. It was late afternoon when we decided to turn in for the day and prepare our tent and our fire pit. We found a nice open clearing that overlooked a beautiful pebbly stream of water, and it seemed that the guide also approved of our camping spot because he nodded vigorously as if registering his approval. We began to set up our tent and prepare our fire pit, because by now we were all utterly famished and could quite literally have eaten a horse. As we were gathering wood and kindling for our fire pit, Simon pointed to a strange humanoid form further down the clearing. "What's that?" he asked me, "over there, making that strange scratching sound?" I walked very stealthily towards the sound, and sitting with her back to me, with a mane of incredibly long dark hair that went well past her waistline, was a naked woman who was covered in this thick mud much like brown body paint that was possibly used to ward off the biting insects, because in these woods you are quite literally eaten alive by the ravenous mosquitoes. The woman was obliviously unaware of our presence and seemed to be digging in the ground frantically with her fingers as if she was searching for something that lay beneath. My first thought was, what was this young woman doing naked in the forest, seemingly all alone like this? And why was she scratching at the ground so vigorously? Could she be mentally deranged, or had she lost her marbles completely? Why was she hanging out in the woods all alone? I didn't know why. I couldn't imagine. "Excuse me," I said. "Are you all right?" The woman's head almost swiveled around to look at me directly, and her blue eyes were filled with absolute terror, and she let out the most horrified, frantic scream, as if I was somehow assaulting her. Simon and I watched in horror and amazement as this nimble, subtle woman ran towards a tree and manoeuvred her sprightly, acrobatic body with the agility of a monkey as she swung gracefully from one branch to another until she reached a higher elevation of the tree, where she stood on deftly her 2 feet, staring down at us. She was hissing at us like a snake, as if warning us to go away. "She's terrified of us," said Simon, looking startled. The woman proceeded to make this very strange call that sounded like she was calling out for help to someone, but the call didn't sound human at all. It was all rather weird and unsettling. Simon shrugged and said, "Let's leave her alone. I think she's as mad as a hatter," he reflected, "running around naked in the woods like this and screaming like a banshee. She must be mentally disturbed." We went back to our campsite and proceeded to cook some bacon and sausages which we'd brought with us. The smell of the delicious sausages and bacon wafted into the air, and my stomach was rumbling. I was in the process of buttering rolls and salivating at the thought of tucking into our delectable feast, when quite suddenly I smelt this really foul odour that was so repugnant that it was like a cloud of sulphurous, disgusting vapour had enveloped our entire campsite with the smell of putrid, decaying flesh. And somehow the sausages and bacon instantly lost their appeal, and I immediately felt like hurling my guts out. Seconds later we heard this thunderous noise, like something like a rhino was trumpeting through the forest, and it sounded like it was yards away from us. The guide's eyes were as round as saucers, and he kept shouting out something at us, and then he scurried away in terror, leaving us all on our own. Before we had a chance to react to our guide's strange, anomalous behaviour, we could feel this heavy creature approaching us, because quite literally the ground vibrated under its mammoth weight. You almost got the strange impression that a huge giant was about to manifest before our eyes, and that's almost exactly what happened. I kid you not, standing 100 yards away from us, looking up at a tree where a woman was hiding, was the colossal humanoid beast that stood on 2 feet and easily was 11 foot tall, 1,000 pounds, and 5 foot wide. This creature was covered in long brown hair and possessed long arms that fell beyond the knees. It had a cone-shaped head and incredibly huge shoulders. "What the heck is that?" asked Simon, with his eyes growing as large as saucers. "Is it going to kill us?" he asked me in terror. The creature appeared to be engrossed in conversation with the woman in the tree, and they were both speaking in a monkey language, backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. I could hear the female's intense tone. She was chattering away in this same language, which was very peculiar. They engaged in this line of conversation for a very long time. Then the big disgruntled giant marched towards us, and he looked far from pleased, like an aggrieved father that had just learnt that I had made his daughter pregnant, and he was about to give me a lashing of a lifetime. He possessed that kind of peeved-off look. "Bloody hell," said Simon. "Is this really happening, or is this all a dreadful dream?" In that moment I was so utterly terrified. I literally froze to the spot, like I was incapacitated like a block of ice, and the only thing I could hear was the sound of my heart thumping violently through my chest. At least I knew one thing: I was still alive. I knew if this creature hurt us, we would never survive the attack, because he was built like a burly, bulky army tank that could effortlessly destroy anything he touched. The creature stood yards away from us and eyed us through its exasperated brown eyes. It was breathing heavily. For a second the creature kicked the ground with his feet in an aggrieved expression of rage, and let out a warning growl. The growl started dissipating almost immediately when the delicious smell of sausages and bacon wafted through the air and distracted the creature's interest. I watched his brown eyes seem to register a hungry glazed look, as if he was thinking, "I'd like some of that." I realised that his keen, eager eyes were definitely focused on the grill from the fire pit that was covered in sausages and bacon, and in a stroke of genius I rushed over to the grill and handed it directly to the creature, whose eyes visibly softened when I handed him all our food. It was like watching an aggressive Rottweiler warning you off his turf, changing in a single second to become significantly more amenable, docile and friendly. The creature reached for a piece of the bacon and gobbled it up, and before long he'd scoffed all our dinner, and he certainly licked his chops afterwards. He really enjoyed it. I could tell that he loved our food. Suddenly he seemed like he was a different creature altogether. It's amazing how food can uplift your mood. His anger had all but subsided, and it was almost as if he'd actually warmed to us. He looked at us as if to say, "Maybe you're more agreeable than I actually thought you were." The creature glided away towards the tree, and I could hear the woman's voice chattering away at him in an irate tone. She sounded furious, as if to say, "Why did you not tear up their camping site?" We watched the wild woman jump from the tree branch to his shoulders, and then they were gone like the wind. Once they both left the area, Simon and I probably said 1,000, "What the heck was that?" We were so gobsmacked by what we'd actually seen. What was the wild woman doing with the ape-like humanoid? And how was she capable of speaking his language? And who was she? And more to the point, who was that creature? And what was it? I'm glad to say the very next morning we did get our guide back. He looked a little sheepish and abashed. I was not about to give him a hard time for deserting us, because we certainly needed his help to escort us from the forest. Once my brother and I had returned to civilization, I did drop into a local police station to tell them all that had transpired, and that there was a wild woman in the forest living with an ape-like humanoid. Do you know what the police did? They absolutely roared with laughter. They couldn't stop laughing. They told us that they really liked the Aussie sense of humour, and that we were incredibly funny, and that we ought to have our own comedy show. In the end, we went along with it, and realised that no one was ever going to believe our story. So from that point onwards, we never ever told anybody. My brother and I got to travel the entire world, and we ended up becoming dentists, like my parents. We still live in Melbourne, Australia, but this time with our own wives and children, and these days I live in Perth and my brother in Adelaide. It was only more recently that I discovered the creature we encountered in Brazil was indeed a Bigfoot. I know that what we saw is absolutely no fabrication, so I'm not about to share this story with anyone other than an anonymous forum where I'm not subject to ridicule, disbelief and abuse. I am worried about my reputation because it's very significant to me in the medical game, and I'm not about to admit that Bigfoot is real. If you were to ask me in a public forum, I'd lie to you blatantly, only to protect my obviously my job and my position, and I'd say, of course he's not real. In truth, I do not care if you do not believe my story or not. I know what we saw that day, and it is to date without fail the most memorable event of my young life, and seeing Bigfoot was very definitely an incredible moment. I always wonder whether the Bigfoot raised that girl from a child, or was she abducted when she was young by him, or was she a mad, deranged woman that the Bigfoot finally took pity on and took under his wing, or was she a lost child that he took into his charge? Maybe we'll never know the answer to that question. I do believe that woman loved and trusted that Bigfoot. That was very clear to me, as if he was her own family. One thing I will say about those creatures is they definitely are not all violent thugs. I know they have a reputation for that, and I know that some people have had terrible experiences. But I will say this for you. My experience is that they can reason and think for themselves and make their own decisions, like the Bigfoot we encountered all those years ago. It was clear that the woman was bullying him to do something to us, but he made his own choice in the end, so he could think for himself and rationalise. So there you are. That is my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Mason, and I've been a long-haul truck driver for many long years now. So as you can imagine, I've got some incredibly exciting tales to share with you and your listeners that might just make the hair on your head curl, including a very exciting one-on-one encounter that I actually had with the hairy man himself, a way you would never imagine was actually possible. The ironic thing about life is it does have a peculiarly funny way of surprising you and always keeping you on your toes. I say that because growing up in San Francisco in an apartment in Nob Hill, it was really challenging spending many lonely nights without my papa. I remember as young boys my papa would be working for weeks at a time on the open road as a truck driver, delivering freight from San Francisco to Las Vegas. My brother Liam and I witnessed firsthand the stoic isolation and solitariness of my mother's empty, reclusive life that she tried so desperately hard to conceal from us with no avail. We knew that she really missed our papa. I remember my brother and I made a solemn promise to each other as young boys growing up that one day when we got married ourselves, we would never ever become truck drivers. Never, never, never was the operative word, because we did not want our wives to experience the segregation and loneliness that we had personally witnessed at close hand in my mother's secluded and fractured life. Growing up as kids in the 80s, my brother and I had an incredible, vibrant, spirited and colourful life in San Francisco. At that time, rents were still incredibly low, and I think the cost of our 3-bedroom rental was about $550 a month, which at the time we actually thought was rather expensive. In those days, even artists and musicians could actually afford to live in San Francisco, and they would support their carefree, laid-back bohemian lifestyles in the warehouses of Soma and the Victorians of Mission District. This would not invariably be possible today because San Francisco has become ludicrously expensive these days. I also remember the skyrocketing cases of the whole anomaly of AIDS, which came into focus in the 80s. And also there was the terrible 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake that caused a tragic loss of life in the Bay Area, and my mother lost her younger sister Beryl to the 6.9 quake, which she took years to overcome because her sister was her very best friend. I remember as kids we would race down the San Francisco streets on the back of our bikes and our banana seats. It was in the Reagan era and everyone was wearing sweatshirts with the Esprit logos, and it was much more carefree way of life then, as we didn't have the technology we do today. So we were not physically attached to our cell phones and tablets like they invariably are today. Growing up, my brother and I were transfixed by everything mechanical, as we loved the inner workings of a car. I truly thought we'd end up becoming car mechanics, but it seems I was incredibly wrong. The universe clearly had other ideas in mind for us. When I was about 15 years old, my papa took me on a long-haul truck trip just for the fun of it, and I was totally blown away by my papa's job, and I tried to overcome this rising, bubbling passion and enthusiasm within me, but it could not be suppressed. And when my papa gave me a go at the wheel, well, I was now well and truly hooked and definitely smitten with the idea of becoming a trucker. Worse still, the following week, Liam joined my father on an open road trip on his truck, and he was also completely bedazzled by the truck driving phenomenon, and we were seemingly enticed by its attractive allure, and nothing could stop us. I began to realize truck driving was in my genetic makeup because I just loved every aspect of driving a truck. My father inevitably did his best to try and discourage us from following in his footsteps, and warned us fervently about the damaging effects being a truck driver could impose on our marriages. But it would seem that my brother and I could not be discouraged. We couldn't be dissuaded or even disheartened by my father's persuasive warnings. Of course, he was absolutely right, because many years later, after Liam and I began trucking, my father's ominous predictions about our marriages sadly came to pass. We can both testify to the ugly demises of 2 of our marriages, as we now have 2 divorces each behind our belts, which is a pretty hectic and heavy price to pay. I also have 2 boys from my second marriage that are both now in their late teens, that are showing a very keen interest in following in my footsteps, and try as I might, I am having huge difficulty in thwarting their eager enthusiasm and intrigue about trucks, much to my ex-wife's absolute infuriation. She keeps telling me to tell them that trucking is absolutely awful, and that I hate every aspect of it, but that's going way too far, because I'm not going to lie to my kids. How can I pretend to despise something that I clearly love and adore? That would be blatantly dishonest and deceptive. My attitude is that I cannot stop my kids from following their passions in life, as that would be grossly unfair. A lot of people ask me what it is about trucking that I love so very much, and I think I enjoy the quality of personal time I have on the open road, and I do spend a great deal of time driving through some of America's most exquisite scenery while listening to my nostalgic, upbeat 80s music that I have never wearied of. The more modern stuff, especially that hideous rap, is something I just do not appreciate and have a very hard time understanding why anybody enjoys that kind of stuff. It invariably can get lonely on the open road, driving over long distances, so if driving a truck is not in your blood, it's unlikely to work for you. I've seen many truck drivers throw in the trowel in defeated despair because they could not hack the long solitary hours of driving on your own. In some cases, people share the drive load with a partner, and that seems to work out better for some who cannot bear the solitude and isolation that truck driving invariably brings. Anyway, on with my stories. On one occasion I was driving my truck in the early evening, and it was literally bucketing down with rain, and it was coming down in cats and dogs, making the road precariously difficult to navigate, and seeing through my windscreen was becoming onerously difficult. I could hear the ominous roll of thunder in the distance, and I knew that this was going to be one heck of a storm. I had a small quota of time to meet my delivery windows in, so I was ultimately going to do my level best to drive through this inauspicious-looking storm, as awful as that was. I knew driving like this was rather reckless, treacherous and dangerous, but quite frankly I didn't have much of a choice. It was getting dim, and I could see the bright yellow, jagged electric light of the lightning piercing through the sky, and the atmospheric electricity on this evening seemed heightened in its intensity. I was driving extra slowly on this occasion through a very built-up small town full of ice cream parlours, boutiques, delis, shops, diners, coffee shops and restaurants. Most of these were closed, obviously, apart from the restaurants, of course. I noticed 2 people actually huddled under a large oak tree trying to block out the rain and waiting to cross the road as the traffic light was still red. I stopped my truck immediately and signalled for the 2 people to cross by flashing my lights. I wanted these 2 poor drenched people to cross the other side of the road, where they would invariably reach shelter under the cover of the shopping arcade. They were completely soaked to the skin, with no raincoat or umbrella between the 2 of them. In that precise moment, the huge oak tree they were sheltering under was suddenly struck by lightning. The explosive sound was so deafening and way too close for comfort. I have never seen something so alarming and so apocalyptic in all my life before. I observed this lightning literally blow these two people off their feet and thrust them into the air like rag dolls, and it almost looked like they were exploding like fireworks. It was quite frankly horrifying to observe, and I was terrified. I immediately wasted no time in jumping out of my vehicle and dashing precariously towards the two bodies lying on the ground, with their clothes lying in shreds and tatters around them. I was almost certain I was going to observe two deceased bodies. The teenage boy had completely lost his shorts. They had literally been blown off his body in the explosion and were filled with huge holes. It was bucketing down with rain, and the motionless bodies seemed dead, as I would have expected under the circumstances. But I immediately tried CPR, and I started to shake their bedraggled bodies, and after a while they seemed to become revived and come out of their coma. They did not appear to remember anything that had happened to them after they were actually struck by lightning, but through the colossal gaping holes with their jagged burnt edges of their clothes, I could invariably see that they were very badly burnt indeed. I called emergency services at once and helped the man and his teenage son out of the rain by escorting them back to my truck. While we waited for the emergency services to arrive, I remember father and son were so stunned that they literally sat there like zombies, staring out into space for a very long time and not saying a word. I mean, who could blame them? I think their close shave with death had really knocked their socks off, possibly physically, mentally, and very definitely emotionally. I was to examine the burns on their bodies, and I promise you they were third-degree burns with large red rings on their backs that looked like scalding from a boiling kettle. I was surprised that they weren't in pain, but I gather after the shock wore off they did experience a great deal of agonizing discomfort. The emergency services were utterly amazed that they hadn't been killed instantly, given the state of their injuries. But I'm glad to say father and son did both survive these ghastly, grievous injuries and received intensive treatment for their burns, and I gather they made a full and remarkable recovery. Now, being a truck driver, you do invariably get to observe some strange characters on the road, but never more so than on a late winter's evening in Tennessee. I was driving down the road to the scene of a horrifying collision. It appeared to be that one car had smashed quite badly into the back of a small, very cheap-looking utility vehicle, and so I got out of my freight truck to see if I could help at all. There was a young woman looking very shell-shocked because the front of her car had taken a very bad hit, and it would seem was completely smashed in, the engine through the dashboard, so to speak. Frankly, I was amazed that she could have caused so much damage to the front of her car, unless, of course, she'd been speeding, which I suspected was invariably the case. I did detect a somewhat sheepish glazed look on her face, which quite frankly affirmed what I'd previously suspected. I could see a man in his 30s who appeared to be climbing to the back of his vehicle via the front seat area, almost as if he was trying to retrieve something from the boot area of his car. His boot was completely mangled and could not be accessed through the back door. The woman was trying to dial emergency services on her phone with her shaking fingers and having very little luck, when quite suddenly the man brought out of his car a long dangling human leg, which he placed on the side of the road, with a very dispassionate look on his face, almost as if he was retrieving an old smelly carpet from the back of his car. I'm afraid the leg came off my mother's body in the accident. Still, it can't be helped. And he said this in such a nonchalant way, as if he was discussing a weather report, and there was nothing wrong about bringing out a dismembered body part out of his vehicle. I was so horrified that I just stared blankly at this man like a mummified corpse, hardly daring to believe what I was actually witnessing. Could this really be happening before my eyes, I wondered, while the woman began to scream, "Oh my God! Oh my God, I've just killed his mother! Oh my God!" She burst into floods of inconsolable tears. The slender hillbilly returned to the vehicle and proceeded to drag out his mother's deceased body with its dangling loose hand and dragged it along the road like it was a sack of potatoes. If things couldn't have got any more bizarre, stranger or peculiar, they invariably did. He then brought out another deceased body and put it beside the body of his mother. It looked like a young female, and she was also deceased. I was so bowled over with amazement that they had actually both died in this accident, and that this hillbilly was acting in such a detached, indifferent manner about their sudden and tragic demise. This time the woman started to scream. "Oh, my God! I've killed 2 people!" she said, freaking out. "I'm definitely going down for this. I better call my lawyer." I could see her tapping as fast as she could into her cell phone, and luckily it would seem her fingers were now more composed. "Dad!" she cried. "I've just killed a mother and a daughter." Her phone was on speaker, and I could hear her father say, "You've done what?" And I could hear a woman's voice say, "What has Nicolette done now? Do not tell me she's been speeding again. I warned her about this." "Dad, I've killed 2 people. I need a lawyer, now." "You've got to be kidding," came her father's voice. "What the hell happened?" "I drove into the back of this man's utility vehicle, and I killed 2 women instantly. And her leg is lying separated from her body on the road. Dad, if I'm going to go down for this and spend my life in jail, everyone's going to call me a murderer. All my friends, everybody, they're all going to accuse me of murder." "Now, hush," came the father's voice. "Where are you?" "I'm coming now, and I'll get a lawyer onto the case now. Do you understand? Nothing to worry about, dear." The 30-year-old yokel looked at the woman and said, "Why are you crying? You've got insurance, right, for the car, right?" "I'm crying because I've just killed 2 women. I can't believe you're acting so indifferent when your mother and your sister, I assume, have both been killed in this tragic accident, and you're acting like nothing has happened." "Well, I didn't care for them much anyway," said the man. "Never did like my mother. She was always such a busybody, poking her nose in everybody's business. And as for my sister, she was a spoilt brat. I'll be damned if I pay any funeral costs for the 2 of them. Do you have any idea how expensive a coffin is these days? Oh, and the cost of a funeral, it's crazy. What did those miserable cows ever do for me? I'll be damned if I fork out a single penny for them." "You know, you really are cruel," said the woman. "You don't care that your own mother and sister have just died. All you care about is money. And as for me, I'm going down for murder for this, I'll have you know. And how do you think that makes me feel?" The man began to laugh. "You think you killed my mum and sister? I found them a couple of hours ago in the house, because they both died of carbon monoxide poisoning because of that broken-down old water heater. I kept warning the old lady about the poison gases, but she was too tight to get it fixed. Serves her right, if you ask me." "You mean I didn't kill them?" cried the woman, looking agog. "You mean they were already dead? You've got to be kidding me." Suddenly I realised that this was all incredibly bizarre. "What on earth are you doing with these bodies loose in your car like this anyway? Should you not have called the authorities and got a funeral home involved to remove their corpses from your home in the first place? And what about certifying and formalising their deaths? They might need a post-mortem as well to verify the cause of death. It might not be carbon monoxide poisoning that killed them. That needs to be investigated. It's very illegal, I think, to handle the body yourself like this." "I told you," said the man. "I want to avoid funeral costs. Why should I inject a penny of my hard-earned money for my sister and mother? Are you kidding me? I'm not going to do that. And I tell you, I can't stand paperwork of any kind. I need to dump them off at the body farm because they accept donations. That's why I came out at night. Do you think you could take me in your truck to dump them off? I don't want anyone to see me. My car's a complete write-off. It'll take me just a second to load them in your truck, and I'll be quick, I promise. They should not be any trouble at all. I mean, they are dead." "Most certainly not," I snapped. "I want nothing to do with this mess you've got yourself into. You'll have to tell the authorities yourself what you've actually done. This is not my problem, and I refuse to get involved." "I haven't done anything wrong," snapped the man. "I'm just trying to save a bit of money. What's wrong with that?" "What's a body farm?" asked the young woman, who'd become more composed and appeared to be somewhat intrigued. "I've never heard of such a place." The man pulled out a piece of paper from his pockets. "It's at the University of Tennessee Anthropological Research Facility, a few miles from downtown Alco Highway. It's for the study of body decomposition in various settings, and they do accept body donations. You cannot donate your family's body to the body farm, I told the man. I imagine there needs to be a specific clause in their will that stipulates they want their body to be donated to the body farm for research purposes. You can't just dump them off willy-nilly like that. Are you kidding? I thought if I threw them over the fence, that would all be fine, said the man. I'm sure they're grateful for all the donations they can get. And what about anonymous donations? Aren't they an added perk? Even the young woman began to look at the man in absolute horror. Are you for real? She gasped. I can't believe you actually just said that. Do you know nothing about the law in North America? You can't randomly throw dead bodies over fences just because you want to save a bob or two. Suddenly we saw a man and a woman rushing towards the young woman with frantic looks on their faces. Oh, sweetheart, said the father. I've got the lawyer on the phone. He's going to sort this wretched grim business out for you, I promise. Now remember, you were not driving fast, and it was an accident. Can you remember that? You weren't driving fast, and it was an accident. The girl smiled jubilantly at her father and gave him the hugest hug. Dad, I didn't kill them, she said happily. Isn't it amazing? I didn't kill them. They were already dead, in the car. He was just going to dump them off and throw them over the fence at the university when I happened to drive in the back of a vehicle. Isn't that fantastic, Dad? The father and mother stared at the man with horrified looks on their faces, as if they were looking into the very eyes of the Grim Reaper, and I could tell by their terrified expressions that they were definitely in flight mode. Before I knew it, they were escorting their daughter back to their cars and running as fast as they possibly could, with a young girl protesting indignantly. But, Mum, I need to wait for the police. What's all the rush? I have to file a report. I realised with all these shenanigans going on that none of us had actually got round to calling emergency services, and so I quickly dialed 911, and within minutes we were surrounded by ambulance sirens and flashing police cars, and the hillbilly was being bustled away in the back of a police car in handcuffs, protesting his innocence. I didn't kill them, he kept saying over and over again. I was just dumping them off at the body farm. What's wrong with saving a bit of money? Doesn't anybody understand that? I was to find out later that that hillbilly was in fact telling the whole truth, and his mother and sister were actually killed by carbon monoxide poisoning due to a water heater, and he was trying to dispose of the bodies in order to save on funeral costs. It really is a funny old world out there, and some of the stuff is so ludicrous you literally cannot make the stuff up. It's off the charts, totally crazy, which makes the world of fiction almost seem dull by contrast. Another time I was out on the roads. It was late evening during the week, and as I was driving I became desperate to relieve myself, and as it was a rather remote area, I was luckily able to pull my truck to the side of the road and finally park. I know of truck drivers who wear adult nappies because they don't want to take the time to stop, and there are invariably people who will pee in their bottles, but I prefer to do it the most civilised old-fashioned way possible by going behind a tree. Armed with a headlamp, I climbed over the guardrail, scurried down the grassy embankment, and wasted no time to find a large oak tree to relieve myself behind. And as I began to pee, I realised I was relieving myself on a pile of matted hair and green moss. I wondered to myself what on earth it was. It looked like a piece of discarded old carpet. Just as I was wondering what the strange hair-like thing was, it suddenly began to move. I saw two horrified yellow eyes suddenly opening through this bundle of grey thick carpet. It appeared that I was peeing on top of a living creature. I could hardly believe it. The critter must have been sleeping under the large tree and was awoken to me spraying it with urine, and it was not too pleased by the experience. I'll never forget the expression on the creature's face because it looked so startled, surprised, bemused, and very shocked. The creature rose from the ground and locked eyes with me for a very long moment. I realised almost at once that she was female because she had furry breasts. I knew at once it was a Bigfoot because I've heard other truckers talk about the critter before, but never in all my born days did I ever think that I would have an encounter like this, and certainly not in these circumstances. I mean, I never imagined that I'd ever go peeing on a Bigfoot. I think the thing that horrified me the most about the encounter was just how colossal and huge this creature was. You hear about it from people who claim to have seen Bigfoot oh, he was so huge, but when you actually see him in real life, it's a huge shock. I'd say she was 700 pounds, 8 feet tall and 3 feet wide, with a very distinctive bullet-shaped head, massive shoulders, and arms that were so long that she could have quite literally touched her ankles without bending over. The creature was covered in this long matted shaggy hair that really looked like a huge shaggy carpet, that could have done with a very good brush. I noticed Spanish moss was also growing in her hair, which was exceedingly odd, I thought. The creature had a very gentle-looking angular face and a flat nose and a slender mouth, and very deep-set, kindly golden eyes. I looked at the critter sheepishly because I did feel very embarrassed, especially when I was looking at the wet spot that I'd actually created on a small part of her torso, which she wiped down and actually smelt with her hands. That also was humiliating, because I'm quite sure it didn't smell great. I could tell she wasn't at all impressed, but she was much more upset to have actually been discovered and located by me than the actual act of peeing on her. I think these Bigfoots are very evasive and elusive, and they don't like to be discovered by humans. If they're going to do any encountering, I'm sure it's really on their terms and not on ours. The creature got up and glided away into the woods with 5-foot strides, swinging her long arms backwards and forwards with such synchronicity. She was so agile, majestic and lofty, and she was beautiful to watch. I don't think I've ever seen anything move so fast and with so much grace. I also never sensed any animosity from her whatsoever, and I should have been terribly afraid, but I guess my shock was literally hijacked my fear. Even so, if you look at how imposing and majestic and powerful and strong she was, I should have been terrified. But I think it was her gentle demeanour that literally calmed me down. On reflection, I'm very glad I didn't pee on a male Bigfoot, because my trucker friend assured me that if I had done that, things might have taken a very different turn, because it would have appeared that I was acting very dominantly, and things could have turned very badly for me in those circumstances, and I have a sneaky feeling that he might be right, because I don't think a male Bigfoot wants to be challenged by a male human. So there you are. That's my story. Did I not tell you that the life of a trucker is a very interesting life indeed? Now you know why I like my job. So that's my story. Well, I just want to say thank you so very much for that story. And I was so intrigued by this story because you can't make this stuff up. It's just so incredible. And I was just looking up about the body farm, and there is a body farm where people can donate their bodies. And the reason it was actually created was because police and forensic science actually like to be able to know how long a body has been deceased in the manner that the body was actually found. So in this body farm, you can actually look it up on YouTube if you want, unless you can't stand looking at gruesome stuff, because I want to tell you it's very gruesome indeed. But they have bodies, under fences, and bodies in the ground, and bodies in all kinds of precarious positions. Obviously, they have to protect them from predators because they want to watch the whole decomposition process so that they can literally determine how long a person was deceased by the kind of insect life that was eating it. They like to see the whole process of decomposition, like when the body bloats and then explodes and all that stuff. So obviously, this guy thought he heard about it. Maybe he was just trying to think of a way that he could dispose of the bodies of his mother and his sister. And I can't believe he thought he could get away with doing that without any legality involved. But he literally wanted to throw those bodies over the fence as a donation to the body farm. And as the guy rightly says, you literally have to have a clause in your will where you literally donate your body to the body farm. So it's a fascinating thing, and it's just so hilarious to think that this guy would literally think he could just dump the bodies like that without a buy or leave. And I just found that really quite unbelievable, how some people don't seem to know the law of the land. But anyway, it was an incredibly fascinating story. And as you say, some things that are actual fact are much more exciting than fiction. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Evangeline, and I grew up in Chicago, which is now a booming, dynamic, vibrant, multidimensional metropolis which is pretty extraordinary because its early humble trade post routes were probably ill-prepared for Chicago to develop into such an imposing, impressive city, which it invariably is today. Many people wonder why one would ever choose to live in a city where 9 months of the year you have to put up with icy conditions and tons of snow, and may invariably spend much of that time hibernating indoors. I think my family rarely enjoys the Midwestern heritage here, along with the exquisite sandy beaches, excellent places to eat, from Mexican, Asian and Indian foods, and the colourful, diverse culture that we have here. We may have cold winters indeed, but we also have the most exquisite 90 days of summer that you could ever envisage or imagine, with lots of barbecues and al fresco dining. Being islanders, we all tend to gravitate towards water, and one of my all-time favourite places to frequent is Lake Michigan, and I literally love going cycling or taking our 2 French bulldogs for walks there. Another great thing about Chicago is that we do have an excellent way to navigate the transport system, from our trains to our buses, and we also have the most amazing museums, parks and festivals, which make living here all the more exciting and very interesting. So I think Chicago is a phenomenal place to live. I've spent my entire life living in this very pretty residential neighbourhood called Bucktown, Illinois, which is located close to excellent shopping, restaurants and plenty of nightlife. I do live in a double-storey contemporary-style red brick home on a very quaint little suburban street with its pretty treed pavements and individualistic-styled homes built in close proximity together, which gives our street incredible charm and character. I live in my home with my mother and father and my 2 older sisters, Beatrix and Victoria. My strange Bigfoot story rarely begins when something quite extraordinary began to happen to me. It would seem that when I was 15 years old, I began to experience the most extraordinary panic attacks, which includes the violent heartbeats and the disorientated blurry vision that made me feel that I was literally about to die. The first time that I had this bizarre experience, I remember I was standing in the clothes department in a large department store in downtown Chicago. Suddenly I began to feel my heart racing through my chest at 1,000 miles an hour. My breathing became shallow and very fast, while my body heat soared to such an extent that I was almost drenched in sweat, and my vision became incredibly blurred. I began to fear that I would drop down dead in a second in this department store. And I promise you, the idea of drawing this much attention to myself from the passing strangers in the shop made me sick to my stomach. I was actually more concerned about that than dying, which is exceedingly bizarre, but that's me for you. I remember reaching out for a chair and holding on to it for dear life with my hands, squeezing the wood as hard as I could. And then I just bolted out of that door, running out of the store as fast as I could towards the parking lot, where I dived into the seat of the nearest taxicab that I could find and begged the driver to take me home as quickly as he possibly could. When I returned home, I became very calm, and my former frantic, outrageous, fearful behaviour simply receded and retracted, making me feel so daft and incredibly silly. Why on earth had I been so anxious and behaved so bizarrely, I wondered in horror. This sort of thing had never happened to me before. After this very peculiar event, the anxiety-induced phenomena would invariably rise up unannounced, like a horrifying serpent ready to strike its victim down, and would occur to me in numerous places on a regular basis, and it was beginning to ruin my life. I would be shopping in the supermarket for my parents, and in the middle of a transaction, I would have to bolt out of the store and run towards a taxicab, flagging it down, leaving behind all my groceries in the cart, and the shoppers queuing behind me saying, "What the hell happened there?" I've also been in hair salons in the process of having my hair washed, and in petrified terror, I've hightailed it out of the salon with my hair full of soapy suds, leaving onlookers looking very perturbed. Worst of all, I've even run out of the dentist's room in the middle of a procedure, I kid you not. Before long, this crippling, embarrassing and harrowing fear just literally saturated my life like a looming black thundercloud that unfortuitously hung over my life like a baleful boomerang that could strike me down at any time, whenever. Whatever was happening to me, it was literally sucking and sapping the life out of me like a leech. Before long, I was almost completely housebound because I was so petrified of having a panic attack again, It was like the fear of actually having a panic attack was almost as debilitating and disturbing as the panic attack itself. It was a vicious cycle for me that could happen almost anywhere and everywhere, and it would always creep up on me unannounced in such a stealthy way, like a cheetah emerging from the dark shadows. One thing I know is that every time this transpired, I would feel absolutely certain that I was going to die. And these irrational phobias confiscated all my common sense, and I ultimately believed the very worst about my physical predicament. I remember the worst places for these attacks were where white shopping malls were, with never-ending areas of white tiled floors and bright lights used to enhance the attractiveness of stores. It always seemed to set me off in a full-blown attack, so I hated those places. My parents became grievously concerned about my mental health and the destabilizing and dismantling effects that these attacks were having on my young teenage life. I was being robbed of interacting with my friends, going to school, and any other extracurricular activities like parties and exciting outdoor events. In truth, I had become like a prisoner trapped in my own home. It would seem that at home, or in our family car, or even a stranger's taxicab, I always felt very safe and secure. But out there in the big wide world, I felt incredibly vulnerable, assailable, insecure, and terribly afraid. Soon my parents were escorting me to multiple doctors and psychologists, and I had no end of blood tests and all kinds of mental health evaluations, and everything came back normal. I was presented with a clean bill of physical and mental health, although the psychologist did ascertain that I was displaying many symptoms of post-traumatic disorder, which my parents thought was utterly ridiculous. This was because my parents believed emphatically that I'd never been exposed to any kind of emotional trauma in my entire life. One of the doctors had prescribed anti-anxiety medications for me that had worked significantly well in reducing my high stress and anxiety levels, enabling my life to become much more manageable. But sadly, the attacks never faded completely, nor did they completely subside. I was living a precariously uncertain life, always looking over my shoulder, wondering if that hostile, unfortuitous boomerang would strike me down again. One day my mother was having a book club meeting at our home, and the women were all discussing the book that they had been reading. It just so happened that one of the characters in the book was a very nice gentleman whom had sadly been involved in the Vietnam War, and was exposed to so much grievous death and violence and killing that the after effects devastated him so much that he began to experience the disabling effects of post-traumatic stress disorder. It would seem the woman began to discuss the implications of this disorder when my mother started sharing with her friends my huge struggle with anxiety and panic, so that they began to discuss the subject among themselves. "I took my Evangeline to the psychologist," my mother told them. "He told me that my daughter was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder." "I mean, how ridiculous is that? Evangeline has never been exposed to trauma a day in her life," she remarked. "There's no way her anxiety can be related to that." "How do you know that for sure?" asked Lily, one of the ladies. "I was abused by my uncle when I was young, and no one in my family ever knew about it for many long years." My mother looked shocked. "You think an adult has abused Evangeline?" asked my mother in absolute horror. "Anything is possible," said Lily. "Or she could have a repressed memory of a traumatic event that she cannot even remember. That's also conceivable. It happens quite often, and young children are renowned for suppressing traumatic events and memories. I know that for a fact." "You are kidding," said my mother. "You think Evangeline could be suppressing a painful memory of some kind?" "It's highly possible. You know, you should send your daughter to a regression therapist," suggested Sue, another one of the ladies at the book club. "That's what I would do if I was in your shoes. They can work wonders, you know. I've heard they have the ability to take you back to the traumatic event so that you know what the root cause of the trauma actually is. Apparently, when you get to the root of your problem, that's the only time that you can actually heal. You have to face the problem head on. You have to know what it actually is." So there we were, fast forward a week, and I was sitting in a therapist's white swanky leather recliner in a very debonair state-of-the-art looking office that was painted in a very pretty pale green colour, was calming and relaxing, and smelt prettily of lemongrass. The therapist entered the room smiling. I noticed that she was a very congenial middle-aged woman who possessed a very kind and gentle demeanour that I warmed to almost immediately. I felt I could trust her which I think was significant for someone with my issues. "Hello, Evangeline," she said. "Your mother tells me that you have been experiencing big issues with anxiety that causes you a great deal of stress. Is that right?" "Yes," I said. "I used to be so confident, carefree and happy, but now I'm always afraid of having a panic attack." "What are you really afraid of, Evangeline?" she asked me. "The trouble is I really don't know, but when I have an attack, I always think I'm going to die." "Well, that's very common with a panic attack," the therapist assured me. "It happens to the best of us. Now, what I'm going to ask you to do in this session is to go back to the source of that anxiety, because even though you ultimately do not remember or even know what caused you this fear in the first place, your higher self knows everything about you, and I'm going to connect with that part of your subconscious mind to ask it to take me back to the source of that fear so we can establish what has caused you so much trauma in the first place. It's much like pulling out a weed in your backyard. If you just pull out the leaves without removing the root, that weed grows back and the problem resurfaces and sometimes becomes stronger and even more aggressive. If you pull the weed out by the roots, then it doesn't grow back. In this session, I'm aiming to find the root so that ultimately we can pull it out in one go. So what I'm going to do during our session is I'm going to ask you to relax, and as we count down, I'm going to transport you back into time as if we are in a time machine, and your higher self will answer my questions. Do you understand? "I think so," I nodded. "Good, so let's get started." Before long, I was lying back in this recliner, and the therapist was beginning to relax me as she kept counting down and down and down, and finally she began to ask me all kinds of questions. "Evangeline, I want you to go back to the first time you became afraid. What year is it?" "It's July the 13th, 2005. "How old do you think you are?" "I think I'm 7 years old. Yes, I'm 7. "What are you wearing?" "I'm wearing a pale green dress with white shoes." "Where are you?" "I'm with my parents and both of my sisters in a forest." "What are you doing in the forest, Evangeline?" "Well, we're camping there. My father is actually barbecuing on the fire pit, and he's making us burgers. I'm feeling very hungry." "What are you doing now?" "I'm playing with my sisters in the woods, but my mother told us we must stay close to the campsite. She doesn't want us to wander off. She's very afraid of us getting lost and losing our way." "What are you playing? Can you see what you're playing?" "I think it's hide and seek. Yes, that's right. It's hide and seek. Now, Evangeline, I want you to focus on the area where you first feel that fear. Where are you now?" "I'm hiding from my sisters behind this very big tree. I think it's an oak. Something is tapping, or someone is tapping me on the shoulders. I think that Beatrix has already discovered me, and I feel very disappointed and rather cross because I thought I had found a really good hiding spot. I finally turned my head to acknowledge Beatrix, but it's not Beatrix that has touched me. I'm so startled because I can't believe what I'm seeing. I've never seen anything like this before." "Who is touching you, Evangeline? Describe the person to me." "Oh, no, it's not a person. It's a huge, hairy giant. It's very, very big and very scary to look at. I've never seen anything so colossal before. This thing is larger and stronger than a grizzly bear, and it's standing up on 2 feet like a human. It's a very thick creature with lots and lots of muscles, and it's got breasts too. It must be female. It's staring at me with these big brown eyes." "What are you scared of, Evangeline? Why are you scared of this creature?" "Because it's big and it's frightening. I'm thinking that it might want to eat me or to hurt me or harm me. I'm not sure what it wants." "Why would you think that, Evangeline?" "Because the creature is intimidating. It's powerful like a lion or tiger. It's very frightening." Now I want you to engage with the creature's psyche for a moment. I want you to perceive yourself through the creature's eyes. Try and read her energy and see what you get from her. See what she really wants with you, and see if you can tap into her emotions and feelings. You can do it. Try. I sense she doesn't want to hurt me at all. I'm surprised by that. I think she's very sad and lonely, even though she does have friends, but she doesn't have any children of her own. I think she's recently had a stillbirth. She's emotionally fragile and very overwrought. She was broken up by the death of her youngling and has not come to terms with it. It's eating her up in shreds inside her. She feels so desperate and hopeless, like she's really lost in life. How does that make you feel, knowing that about this creature, I mean? I feel very, very sad for her. It makes me want to cry because I can sense her desperate, debilitating pain, almost as if it was my own. I can feel it. I think she feels so lost and alone, as if her life has somehow lost its purpose and meaning, and even value. So what does this creature want with you then, Evangeline? I think she wants to take me to her home with her. She wants to find a substitute for her youngling that she lost so tragically. I think she wants to raise me as her own child. She so desires and longs to be a mother again, more than anything else in this entire world. She feels that it's what she's meant to do, that it's her life's purpose, and that's what she's here for in the first place. That's all she desires. Well done, Evangeline. Well done. You're doing incredibly well. I'm so proud of you. Now I want you to tell me, what is happening next? What is she doing? Is she standing there? Is she moving? Is she looking at you? What's she doing now? Well, she's picking me up and carrying me over her shoulders, and she wants to take me back to her home. Why are you not screaming, Evangeline? Why aren't you letting your parents know that you're being abducted by this creature? I'm too scared to scream, because I think the creature could hurt me if I screamed. You know from the creature's energy that she would never hurt you, right? I know that now, but the little me doesn't know that. The little me is feeling very, very afraid. Of course you are. Now tell me, what's happening next? The creature's running with me on her back. She's moving very fast. She's very swift. I can hear her breathing. She sounds like a horse when they breathe. I feel that she wants to run as fast as she possibly can, and she's very, very fast. Now I want you to tap into her energy again, Evangeline. What is she feeling now? I sense she knows she shouldn't be abducting me. She knows it's very wrong. But her longing for a child is so unbearably strong that it's driving her and propelling her to take me with her. She wants a child that badly. What happens next, Evangeline? I can hear my mother screaming my name. She sounds frantic and desperate and terrified. I think she's looking for me and she can't find me. The creature stops dead in her tracks because she hears my mother's desperate calls. Tell me, Evangeline, how is the creature feeling now when she hears your mother crying out like that in terror? I sense she feels absolutely terrible because she knows the pain of losing a child herself. I think she realizes that she cannot take me from my mother. She understands that she would inflict too much pain on her, and she can't do it to someone else. So she's deciding to return me to my mother, and she turns around and runs back with me on her back and puts me back behind the oak tree where I was previously hiding. I watch her moving away. She moves like the wind. She is so graceful and beautiful. But now I know how she's feeling. I feel very sad for her. What is happening next, Evangeline? Tell me what's going on now. My mother finds me. She's shaking me very hard and very aggressively. She's furious with me. I think she's seething because she thinks I deliberately didn't answer her when she called out for me. She's reprimanding me severely and telling me that I'm very naughty and I must never make her scared like that again, and that I was a very bad child to do that. I tell her that a big hairy lady took me. What does your mother say to that? She ignores me because she thinks I'm making all kinds of excuses and telling fibs. She believes I've been very badly behaved, and she's not happy with me. She's decided to ignore me because she's so very angry. I can see it in her face. Her face is bright red. She keeps looking at me, and she looks mad. Now, Evangeline, I want you to tune into the energy of the creature that you just saw. You found the source of your fear. You realize that now. Was it foolish to be fearful of this creature? What does your higher self say about that? I have nothing to fear, because the sad creature has a beautiful, kind, gentle energy, and she would never have ever hurt me. All she wanted was to be able to give and receive love, like a mother does. How do you feel about your panic attacks now, knowing that this creature that you encountered is in fact the root cause of your fear? I feel very silly and very pathetic. There was nothing to fear. There never ever was. Good girl, I'm proud of you. You're right, Evangeline. You have nothing to fear. So I want you to release that fear now. Let it go. I have the root here in my hand, and I'm pulling it out, and the fear is withering and dying as I speak. And now it is gone. There is no root to that fear any more. Do you understand that? I think so. I definitely feel that the fear is gone. Good. That was the end of my session. After my session, I was amazed how sad I felt for the hairy creature that I now know to be a Bigfoot. The poor critter wanted to abduct me because she had recently experienced a stillbirth, and she was looking for a substitute for her unbearable pain. I know what she intended to do was clearly wrong, but in the end it would seem that her conscience definitely got the better of her. I was amazed of the session that I was able to tap into her energy and feel her very thoughts and even her emotions, and it gave me an opportunity to understand and perceive her own behaviour and why she had tried to abduct me in the first place. After my incredible session with the therapist, I subsequently found out from my parents that I had been in a forest in the area in the Pacific Northwest when I went on a camping holiday in 2005. My mother said I was playing hide and seek with my sisters, and when they could not find me, they alerted my parents. I gather my mother was absolutely enraged with my older siblings for not keeping an eye on me, which is irrational because we were playing hide and seek at the time. My mother believed that I had wandered off and become very frantic, but I gather I was not gone for very long. They were oblivious to the fact that I was nearly abducted. I was apparently about 7 at the time. Beatrix was 10 and Victoria 9, which affirmed what I had observed in my regression therapy. I want to tell you, after the regression session, my panic attacks never ever returned, and my parents believed the therapy was miraculous for some reason. I never told anyone about the Bigfoot in my regression therapy. I know it sounds odd, but I didn't want to share my encounter with anyone. But in this anonymous forum I thought, well, why not? So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Sheila and I'm from Washington State, where I work as a hairdresser. Since I was knee-high to a grasshopper, there is nothing that I was more desirous to do than people's hair. My father remembers that even when I was only 8 years old, I would stand on a little stool behind the back of a leather chair he was sitting on, and while he was reading a book, I would play with his locks of inky black hair. My father enjoyed me tweaking, pulling and twirling his hair because it was rather like experiencing a pleasant, rather invigorating head massage. I'd play with my sister Alice's hair as well, virtually all the time, and I would spend ages braiding it and creating all kinds of rather fetching hairstyles, which she absolutely loved. Alice had long, blonde, very pretty hair, and one day when she was sleeping upright in the chair, I couldn't resist cutting her hair really short, as I had this exciting, kinky hairstyle in mind for her that I knew would be extremely becoming and fetching on her Aubrey Hepburn-like face. She let out the most horrified scream and ran to the mirror crying, "Look what you've done! Oh, my word! I look exactly like a boy! I look like a boy! What have you done?" she screamed. "What have you done? How could you do this to me?" I've never seen my sister more distraught because she'd lost all her gorgeous blonde locks. My sister really believed that I'd done it out of deliberate spite, but nothing could have been further from the truth. I just invariably got carried away with a rather creative, inspirational idea in my mind that I wanted to pursue, without actually thinking about the consequences. Ask any artist what that inspirational urge is like. It sort of takes over you. Even if I say so myself, I have to tell you that my sister looked remarkably cute with her hair short. It was not long before she was being inundated by compliments about her funky hairstyle, and even her friends were begging me for haircuts so that I could make them look just like my sister. Ironically, all these years later, my sister still wears her hair very short, as she has got one of those very small petite faces that literally would be drowned out and swamped by very long hair. If you think my creative enterprises began and ended with humans in our home, you would be exceedingly wrong. When I was 10, I actually dyed my white cat Purdy blue and our little hamster Bobby boy purple. I was convinced that my cat rather fancied her new look because she began to display a very swanky attitude, and even my mother believed that she had grown exceedingly vain, as if somehow she knew she looked pretty dapper. My father always walked our dogs daily around the local lake near our home that was frequented regularly by dog walkers. On one occasion I had dyed our 2 white toy poodles bright pink, and my father said that he felt like a prize prat and a real effeminate sissy walking bright pink poodles around the lake. He exclaimed that he was getting these odd, horrified looks from strangers who were walking their more macho dogs. My father even got hit on by a local fashion designer who was walking his Pomeranian around the lake at the time. I gather he was tall, lanky and dark, with these dazzling pink eclectic glass frames, and when he talked, he used this flamboyant expressive gesture with his arms to express himself. I gather he was so enthralled by our pink poodles and was oohing and aahing over them, saying, "Oh, they're just too sweet! Oh my word, they're just gorgeous!" He then told my father that he had the most fabulous taste and the poodles looked absolutely, totally amazing. He proceeded to give my father his calling card and gave him a huge wink and said, "Call me sometime. It would be cool to meet up." My father literally freaked out and made a quick, hasty retreat back home, begging me to please get the pink food dye out of my poodle's hair. I don't think I can cope with another walk like that around the lake. I'm getting some very peculiar, strange looks from people, and I'm awfully embarrassed and very humiliated. So more about where I live now. I love Washington and really enjoy living here and would never envisage living anywhere else in the entire world. Growing up as kids, my family would go fishing, golfing, camping and boating, and as the weather is relatively mild here, you can engage in these activities almost all year round. We do tend to get a lot of rain here, with plenty of drizzly days, but on the plus side we have so much gorgeous green scenery as a result. That includes plenty of evergreen trees that never lose their colour throughout the year. In spring we get exquisite pink spring flowers like tulips, daffodils and apple blossom, so during the summers and springs here, Washington is literally ablaze with cheerful, colourful blooms. We also have silvery lakes, rivers and Puget Sound, not to mention statuesque mountains. Our summers can be so gorgeous here, but most people wish they would be longer, and on occasion we do get 90-degree temperatures. Autumn is literally my favourite month of the year because I just adore the golden russet and red hues of the trees at that time of the year before we get all that tree fall. We do have 2 problems in Washington, traffic congestion and homelessness, but more about the latter later. My Bigfoot story begins when I was running my own hair salon in Seattle, which had become a thriving business for me, with 9 full-time hairdressers working under my belt. At that time of my life, I was married with 2 teenage daughters, Emma and Azalea, who were also beginning to show an eager enthusiasm and intrigue for hairdressing and were increasingly helping me around my salon. One day I decided that given that we had such a huge homeless problem here in Seattle, it would be a rather nice thing to do a before and after makeover for a homeless man off the streets. It was decided that we would book him into a prestigious hotel for a couple of nights so that he could enjoy a good long soak in a hot bath and some delicious warm food. The following day we would take him shopping for some casual smart clothes and we would give him a perfect haircut and a clean-cut shave. Everyone was on board with this fabulous, intriguing idea, not only because it would invariably be an opportunity to show a random act of kindness to a stranger or someone who was down on their luck, but it was also a fabulous promotional opportunity to boot for our up-and-coming hair salon. Fast forward a couple of weeks and I was standing in my hair salon behind the swirling chair of my next client. He was the homeless man receiving our makeover transformation. The young man was about 30 years old and was called Michael, although most people actually called him Mike. He was a amenable, likeable guy whom in appearance alone looked much older than his actual biological age, because if his hard life on the streets is anything to go by, it was hardly surprising. He had long, thick grey beard and long dark hair that he tied back in a very long ponytail, but it was so matted and tangled I had to cut the ponytail off in one swoop. Before long, I'd shaved off this man's beard and was in the process of cutting off his hair. Suddenly the homeless man noticed my long bundles of keys lying haphazardly on my dressing counter next to a large bottle of hairspray. He was pointing at my large cuddly keyring of a Bigfoot. "I've seen one of those," he told me, in such a nonchalant way, as if he was discussing a weather report. It gave me the shock of my life when he told me he'd actually seen a Bigfoot, because I adore the hairy critter. My heart started to race. I literally became so incredibly excited. It was like I could hardly breathe for a moment. I've always had such a fascination and intrigue for Bigfoot. So this is Mike's story that he shared with me quite literally that knocked my socks off, and I hope it'll do the same for you. So this is Mike's story. I grew up in a very dysfunctional family with 2 brothers and a very abusive father, who was no stranger to beating us black and blue if we misbehaved at all. For some strange reason, my father despised me the most, and I was singled out for verbal, emotional and physical abuse day in and day out. One day my father throttled me so hard and so violently that I could barely walk as a result. Even my kind, gentle mother persuaded me to just leave, because next time he's going to kill you, she warned me. My mother purchased me a pop-up tent and a sleeping bag and suggested I camp out in the wood for a while. She told me she would leave food parcels out for me and anything else that I might need, and she would leave it behind a particular tree. So for a year I relied on her handouts until one day they finally stopped coming. By this time I joined many of the homeless on the streets of Seattle. There were times I would spend in and out of shelters, and I relied on the help of charitable organizations and the kindness of strangers to give me food. There were some crazy, really barking mad people living out on the streets that had huge mental health problems and behaved in absurd, strange and bizarre ways, and they could be exceedingly violent, aggressive and very dangerous. Then there were, of course, the alcoholics and drug addicts who were addicted to meth and heroin and stuff like that, and they would use these things to numb the pain of their desperate, miserable existence with these artificial stimulants. Then these all are the people who give the homeless a really bad negative reputation, because we're not all like that. Then there were people like me who were down on their luck due to having lost everything, including their jobs, and youngsters like myself who needed to escape the wrath of a parent or an abuse from a foster home. Believe me, there were stories out there that were so crazy they would turn your dark hair grey if I shared them with you. The things that happened out there to people are more creative than the movies themselves, and that I can assure you of. One day when I was sleeping along the long line of tents there was set up against a large building, and it was about 12 at night, I heard the ominous sounds of beer cans rolling across the ground, and I could hear a man shouting, and his voice was very loud and slurred, and I could tell very definitely he was drunk. But of course I was used to all those sounds, because naturally living in conditions like this, you're always aware of the impending dangers, because it can pounce on you when you least expect it, and this was my night to get really, really unlucky. Before I knew it, the zip of my pop-up tent had been opened, and my tent was suddenly infused with a stale smell of cigarette smoke, stale urine and alcohol. Before I knew it, this dithery drunk lunatic was literally pouncing upon me and stabbing me with a knife, and the blood was shooting out of my wounds. I could see the man was so disorientated and groggy, so I kicked him in between his legs, where it really hurts. Even in his inebriated state, he screamed out in agony. I took this moment to push him to one side, and I somehow managed to escape, and spent the next day or so in hospital being bandaged up and treated for my wounds, some of them that were very deep and rather nasty. Naturally, as could be expected, when I did return back to my camping spot, my pop-up tent and worldly possessions had all but been stolen. This happens a lot to the homeless, having our possessions nicked and seized and taken away. And we cannot even sleep at night with our shoes on, because someone rips them off during the night. It's that crazy, it really is. I was jittery and skittish inevitably after being attacked, and so I knew I didn't want to sleep in Seattle that night. I fancied returning to my mother's neck of the woods, to the forest where I camped out when I was 15 years old, to hide from my father. So I made my way back to the area where I grew up, and was lucky to get a lift from a hostel worker whom I knew lived in the area. When I walked past the house where I used to live with my parents, I was horrified to discover that the whole place had burnt to the ground, and I wondered whether my family was actually still alive. Seeing my old family home burnt to a cinder really made me feel overwhelmed and grievously emotional, as you can imagine, because I couldn't even imagine what might have happened to them. I searched the entire area for cardboard boxes. You see, if you're homeless and you've nothing to sleep in, a cardboard box is the next best thing. It protects you from mosquitoes, dirt, and offers you some kind of insulation and a bare minimum of cushioning. I had not been in that wooded area now for over 15 years, and returning to the woods was utterly extraordinary. The trees had grown so much bigger and fuller, and the forest was quite enchanting and alive with the prettiest bird song. I even observed a couple of Douglas squirrels staring at me curiously with their intriguing brown eyes, and several beautiful white-tailed deers who went scampering past me so hurriedly that they never even observed me. I walked towards the little creek in the woods that I knew very well and set up camp in close proximity to the water. I had no worldly possessions with me, only my huge cardboard box. I remember realizing how crazy I'd been to come out here. I had no money with me, no rifle, no food, no flashlights or matches. I think in my haste and eagerness to leave Seattle, I had overlooked the practical considerations, like the basic necessities of life, as my anxiety about being attacked again quite literally hijacked my common sense. Now I began to realize that I really would need to make a hasty return to Seattle in the morning, because otherwise I could forget about ever eating again or having a hot meal. I was crazy. I don't know what I was thinking. Before long, darkness prevailed over the valley, but I was never more thankful to observe the full moon as I did on that night, along with the scattering of pretty silver stars that lit up the firmament with a soft light that literally dappled the forest so prettily. I was thankful it was a bright night, as it made the distant calls of coyotes and wolves a lot less intimidating and formidable. I decided to get into my cardboard box to get some well-needed shut-eye, and I covered my box with branches and leaves for further insulation and camouflage purposes, although I was aware that without fire and a rifle and my distinct human odour, I might be a magnet for a hungry wolf or a bunch of coyotes, but I refused to engage my mind in such terrifying thoughts that were beyond my control by now. I made sure I just looked like a large discarded box in the woods. It was at about 12 o'clock at night when I was suddenly awoken to find my box being jolted quite vigorously, and I could hear the strange chattering sound that sounded like two people engaging in a gibberish-like language. I became like a nervous wreck, because I had been pounced on before in the middle of the night, so I was feeling incredibly frightened. Suddenly the box I was in was quite literally being pulled apart and torn to shreds. Now my heart was in my chest, and I was literally frozen to the spot in terror. Then I got the fright of my entire life, because I was staring up into the eyes of two big hairy creatures. One was female, and the other must have been her youngling, because although tall, he possessed a very young energy. The creatures were so shocked to see me jump out of the box like that, which I invariably did because I was so startled. I saw that her deep-set treacle-colour eyes literally grew as round as saucers in surprise. I ascertained that she literally believed the box would be great for nesting material purposes, but she had no idea that I was actually in that box. The creatures were about 7 feet tall, with long arms, big shoulders and cone-shaped heads, and they were covered in long, flowing, gorgeous auburn hair. I remember I was so shocked by what I was observing, I just stared at her for what seemed like a very long time, and then it seemed like our eyes locked in a very long gaze. Even the youngster looked gobsmacked to see me, because I doubt he'd ever even observed a human before at such close proximity. He studied me with a very keen fascination, and his eyes travelled up from my feet to my head as if taking in every detail of my appearance. I sensed that he found me a source of great intrigue and curiosity. The critters were not remotely aggressive, but appeared to be somewhat rather perturbed about me, and very befuddled, that I'd been sleeping out here in this box. I think they'd possibly never observed such strange behaviour from a human before, and found this odd peculiarity rather baffling and inexplicable. The creatures then grew a little awkward and uncomfortable in my presence, with the one-on-one interaction with me. I really got the sense that they would rather prefer to keep themselves to themselves and may have been somewhat self-conscious and diffident. The female nodded at me very briefly, and they were gone so fast, moving like the wind with a seamless grace. It was only after a little contemplation that I suddenly realised that the creatures I encountered were Bigfoot, and I have heard that they've got a bad rap before, as many people believe them to be exceedingly dangerous. But this was not my impression with these creatures. In my case I sensed a very warm, loving energy from the critters, but also a very strong reluctance to fully engage with humans, because I don't think they entirely trust us. As you can imagine, Mike's story just blew me away, because I could not believe he'd had such an incredible encounter with a Bigfoot. I mean, it just doesn't get better than that. But if you think the story ends here, you would be incredibly wrong, because things took a twist for the miraculous. Well, at least they did in my book. Once the makeover was complete, I'm not kidding when I say that Mike looked incredible. George Clooney, eat your heart out, because here comes Michael. He really looked like a movie star once he was attired in a brand new pair of Levi jeans and a smart The North Face jacket and sweatshirt, not to mention a flashy pair of Neiman Marcus loafers. I'll never forget the way he looked once we had finished and completed the makeover. He kept looking at himself in the mirror in absolute disbelief. He couldn't believe what he looked like. "Is this really me?" he exclaimed. "I thought I had the face of a robber's dog, but you've turned me into a silk purse." I was to discover that Mike had not actually had a bath in 10 long years, and he told me that his bath water was literally covered in brown-looking scales from all his dead skin cells. He said he really pitied the cleaner clearing away all that nasty bath scum from the tub, because it was absolutely revolting, but that's what living on the streets does. Fast forward a few days, and I'd managed to get Mike living off the streets in a little apartment that one of my wealthy clients said he could use for a few months. One day I had a crazy idea, and I decided to teach Mike to cut hair, but I never imagined what a natural he would actually be. That's what amazed me the most. He took to cutting hair like a duck to water, and furthermore, he seemed to love it, and he was a natural. He also adored complimenting all my female clients, who became so flustered by all his beguiling charm that all the ladies fancied the pants off him. I couldn't help but be bedazzled by his huge physical transformation and his newly acquired confidence that brought out his charming personality that had been subdued and repressed by a hard life living on the streets of Seattle. Before long, women were literally begging for Mike to style their hair, and he even entered competitions where he won all kinds of awards for his innovative styles. He really was quite a remarkable hairdresser. One Monday morning, when the salon was very quiet, I beckoned to a lady to take a seat, as Mike was going to be her stylist that morning. He suddenly realised that he recognised the stranger that was sitting in the seat, and believe it or not, it was his long-lost mother, whom he had not seen for 15 long years. What were the chances of her popping into the salon like that? I watched in tears as Mike literally bawled his eyes out and was hugging the lady and telling her he was so glad that she was alive. The woman looked at Mike quizzically, but then she suddenly recognised him as her son, and they emotionally embraced. It was the most incredible reunion. I was to learn that this sweet mother had actually put out food for her son in the woods for over 15 long years, every single day without exception. And I have a sneaky idea that Bigfoot might have something to do with the missing food parcels that Mike suddenly stopped receiving. It all makes sense now. His sweet mother had written him letters begging him to return home, which he had never ever received. I also learnt that Mike's childhood home was burnt down by his drunken father, who perished in the flames, while the rest of the family managed to escape. Mike was reunited with his 2 brothers, who were so ecstatic to see their brother again, because they didn't know what had happened to him. Mike is now a hugely successful hairdresser with an awesome, formidable reputation behind him. His life as a homeless man on the streets of Seattle has long since been left behind him. Today he runs his own salon in Seattle, but the story of his encounter with the hairy man he has only ever shared with me, and now with all your listeners. He has also never forgotten what it was like to be homeless, so every year we carry on with the same tradition of giving a homeless person a makeover. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.